So now that we've come to the end of phase one and you have started to get to grips with this slots method idea, this thought process that we follow through, I wanted to spend a little bit of time now to help you see how simply following this idea of the slots method and the thought process that we are instilling in you, that you are following the research, you are producing evidence-based programs that to the best of our current ability and knowledge are backed by science, and with that should come a huge amount of confidence in what you deliver. So I want to take the time now to kind of help you frame the slots method in a slightly different light, as well as to then recap through that theoretical foundations table that we went through right before this even started, to help you see how it all marries up, and obviously to hopefully refresh some of the things that maybe have been forgotten along the way. And you'll also hopefully see how once we move into this next phase and you get the advanced template in phase two, how this makes the slots method with our timings, etc., makes creating evidence-based, science-backed programs easy. So what is the slots method? It's the one application of a training stress to a movement or a muscle. We know that there are only so many days a week somebody can train, and within each session there are only so many stimulating exercises or slot opportunities that we can use, because we don't have unlimited time. We can't try and fit too many exercises in. It makes it less productive on a per set basis. And so if we look somewhere around 6 exercises per session, if it's 2 or 3 days per week, that gives us the total number of slots that we have, or opportunities that we have to apply stress over the course of a week. We then have our total number of applications of stress, and we distribute it according to our client's goals. Now, the great thing about the slots method, which is roughly kind of 3 sets, we can decide where we distribute that stress, and then instead of counting sets specifically, we just count the number of slots. And as we mentioned way back in that theoretical foundations, we said that the more stress that we apply to a certain body part or muscle in one training session, the longer it takes for us to recover. But over the course of a training week, if I apply one slot, and we said one slot is probably 3 or 4 sets, it's never going to be much less than that, then for a general population clients, it's probably going to be a stimulating load. Think all the way back when we spoke about volume and intensity and interaction with frequency in that theoretical foundations, and we spoke about that Brad Schoenfeld study, and we said 4 sets per week gets around 64% of the gains that 10 plus sets a week gets. So most of our general population clients, even if we only give them one vertical pushing movement in the week, as long as they are doing it with good form, they're pushing close to failure, we can get them 2/3 of the gains that they would have got if they'd have done 12 sets. So that's amazing. If we are doing 2 slots within, one slot for an advanced individual is probably enough for them to maintain what they've got. We look at studies by a gentleman called Bickel, where people went from 20 plus sets per week down to 3 sets per week, and they maintained for large periods of time. So there may be times when you can't get your client training a body part twice per week or with more than 1 slot, but that 1 slot might be enough to just maintain for that client until another time you can add more slots in. If I have 2 slots for the same muscle group or movement within the same session, then I'm getting pretty close to our session volume cap. We know there's only so much volume or hard sets that we can do in one session before it becomes unproductive. And so if I see at least 2 exercise slots on maybe 2 days of the week for a certain muscle group, I know that I'm getting pretty close to it. So 4 or 5 total weekly slots is getting very, very close to the maximum number of sets that we'd want to see in a bias plan, as we looked at with Jade's program and in the Orb study where we looked at a specialization phase. So adding in 1 or maybe 2 slots to a certain body part from the previous training load or previous training sets is enough to maximize or specialize gains. So if someone comes to me and say they want to build their glutes and they're currently doing 6 sets per week, I may add them in just 1 extra slot that might be enough to really start to specialize their gains, move their exercises to the top of the sessions, all those kind of good things. But the slots method gives us a very easy way to see how the stress is distributed over the week, and then we can say, well, for each body part, depending if the client's advanced or general population, if it's 1 slot, it's either a stimulating load or at worst a retaining load. If there's only 1 slot, then I might look to add an intensification method for it there. If there's 2 slots, within the same session. I probably don't want to do much more than that because I'm going to go over my per session cap. And if the client is looking at 3 to 5 slots for the same body part or movement per week, that is pretty much going to count as a specialization cycle. So you can hopefully see how this idea that I took of the slots method, first of all, says, well, how many applications of stress can I logistically fit in over the course of a training week? How am I going to distribute it? If it's less, it's still a retaining load. If it's more, then I can look to specialize and I can make sure that I'm not doing too much in one session because I know how many slots. And then based on the number of slots that we've got, we can start to think about in one session, how much recovery does that person need? So I think that's really, really beneficial. And I just want to go through the current table now, again, so you can see how, if we just follow through what we've learned in phase 1, you'll be writing evidence-backed programs. So we said in terms of training frequency, typically twice is better than once per week. One, because there's only so much volume we can do. So once we've done those kind of 3 slots potentially for in one session, 2 or 3 slots, adding on more is not going to help. So I have to train more frequently. But we also know for general population clients, they may miss sessions. I want to keep the sessions nice and dense with my paired sets or my supersets. So that's typically going to want to be upper lower. So a slightly higher frequency works well. In terms of training volume, yes, we see the 10 to 20 sets mark banded around, but for us really, if we think about that in terms of exercise slots, that's probably between 3 to 6 exercise slots for a movement or a muscle per week, I should say, but we know that some people can make substantial gains in choosing just one exercise slot per week. And within a session, kind of 2, at the most 3 exercise slots is as much as we're going to need to maximize gains, whilst 1 set is as little as we need actually to maintain for general population clients, but at least 1 slot for 1 muscle per week is going to be enough to maintain. So over the course, as we'll look at in phase 4, it's almost like spinning plates. So maybe my delts, if I've got, someone who can only train twice per week, maybe my delts are on maintenance for a couple of, or 1 exercise slot for a couple of blocks. And then as I move into the next couple of blocks, they come up to 2 or 3 slots and my horizontal pushing comes down. So we're trying to bring some things up and some things are maintaining. We know the effort's got to be pushed closer to failure, and we've got to educate on that effort. Our reps are varied. Yes, we can go lower than 6. Yes, we can go higher than 15. But bang for our buck, 6 to 15 is a good place to be, and we can sprinkle on higher or lower. But strength is a skill that we have to practice. So if somebody wants to improve their back squat 5 rep max, we have to lead them into that with our linear periodization, coming down from maybe 8, 7, 6, and then 5 in the last week of the training or something like that. When it comes to our exercise selection, we're going to prioritize our multi-joint exercises, but we can use our active recovery to add in some isolation work or our filler work, as long as it doesn't violate that golden rule of impacting the main movement. In terms of exercise order, we're going to go with our most complex and most demanding exercises first, our lower repetition exercises first, and then we may finish with the smaller exercises. But the only time we violate all of this is when there is a certain movement or muscle that's a priority. We're going to put that earlier on in the session when there's less central fatigue and we can push harder and get more repetitions. In terms of exercises per session, our exercise slots, if somebody's very, very time poor, it's going to be as little as 4. I wouldn't particularly like to see more than probably 9 main lifts with most people. I think 6 big lifts or 6 slots with maybe 2 or 3 filler exercises is probably going to be a great option for most people. Our set configuration is going to be closely tied to the amount of rest that we want and what we're trying to achieve. So if we are trying to focus on that constant tug of war between quality of work and longer rests and quantity of work and shorter rests, our paired sets and our supersets form a very happy kind of marriage between the two. Paired sets at about 4 minutes per round are going to give slightly more focus on quality, whereas supersets at 3 minutes a round are going to give us a little bit more focus on quantity. But of course, if we have a bilateral exercise with a unilateral exercise, so something like a floor press with reverse lunges, we're going to count that as a triset and never have it as a superset, because we have to allow for left leg, right leg, and then the upper body to go. We always want to consider not only are they making sense physically, so we go through that, okay, are the main muscles competing, are the secondary muscles competing? And a great example is always that goblet squat with that horizontal press, because the shoulders are going to be blown out. Then we're thinking about, does bracing or grip compete? And if none of them compete, then we are doing pretty well by managing the stress within the session. Because remember, we want to distribute the stress over the course of the training week and then organize the stress within the training session to make sure that it is kind of optimized or maximized. Our rest periods will be taken care of by our timed blocks. Remember, we never really just set the number of sets. We multiply the number of sets by the set configuration that we want to use. That automatically tells us how long a block is. And you will get this all in very easy detail actually when you get the next template at the start of next week. Intensification methods. Here we are thinking about things like drop sets, like rest pause, like myo reps, where we can potentially agonist supersets, but we're not going to use them too often, which we can use to increase the amount of stress that a muscle or movement is receiving without increasing the time too much. So when somebody is potentially time poor, as we saw with Sarah, or if a body part only has one slot per week, then we may look to add an intensification method onto it to drive up that stress because it's got a whole week to recover. And we will look at these far more in the next phase when you will get a guide on all of the different methods so you can understand them far more. In terms of progression, we said that double progression is normally going to be a great place for us, but with bigger lifts, we may decide to go to linear periodization, and we may have other times when we're using things like beginner wave or maybe even triple progression for upper body pressing. In terms of testing, most of us will probably take a training is testing type approach, looking to beat last week's logbook. But as you'll see as we move into phase 2, we can set up these introductory weeks and then end of 4 weeks PB weeks, so clients can constantly get an idea of how they're progressing, and we can help them feed into this idea of competency that we want from self-determination theory. We may potentially look to use some AMRAPs, which we'll talk more about as we move into phase 3 and the intensity phase, as well as having some indicator lifts. And again, that is part of phase 2 and 3. And periodization is something that we will cover quite a lot in phase 4, but the main thing we're thinking about is variety for the mind and stability for the body, and that really does bring us on nicely to the second phase. And then the last idea is this idea of specialization blocks, or what we'll become to think of as bias blocks, as we spoke about with Jade and her glute focus program, where simply we look to compartmentalize either certain methods into certain blocks, so we can have these specialization blocks in terms of hypertrophy, intensity, density, or we can have more of a bias block where a certain movement or muscle gets more slots than others. But I really hope you guys, that was a recap and you could have told me all those things before we got to say it, but now you can see that slots method and that thought process that you guys have been working through with our time blocks and our set configurations. In doing all those things, you are absolutely ticking every single box when it comes to evidence-based practice and keeping up to date to the research, but we do it in a very simple and pragmatic way, using that slots method to help you create excellent programs. So I really hope phase 1 was beneficial. Now it's time in that phase 2 where we look to make it fun and interesting, that variety for the mind, that stability for the body.